In the autumn of 1883, a gravedigger named Thomas Aldous Reardon was sent alone to the older section of Cypress Hills Cemetery on the Brooklyn-Queens border to locate and prepare a family vault for an interment scheduled for the following morning. He carried an iron pry bar, a lantern, a chalk marking stick, and the cemetery's plot ledger open to the entry for the Halstead family vault, Section C. Plot 44. He had worked at Cypress Hills for 16 years. He had opened and resealed vaults more times than he kept count of. He knew the older section well, the irregular stone markers, the subsidence patterns after heavy rain, the way certain vault doors had shifted on their frames over decades of frost and ground movement. He found the Halstead vault without difficulty. He set his lantern on the stone surround. He applied the pry bar to the door seam, and what he opened was not the Halstead vault. The door's stone facing matched the plot marker. The ironwork on the interior frame was consistent with a 1840s construction, but the interior of the vault was not configured for interment. There was no shelf ledger. There were no casket niches. The vault was a single undivided chamber, approximately 14 feet deep by 8 feet wide, with a stone floor that descended by a series of cut steps to a lower level that extended beneath and beyond the footprint of the vault entrance above it. Thomas Reardon descended 4 steps. He held his lantern forward. He stood there for what he later described as a very long time. Then he came back up, resecured the vault door, went to the cemetery superintendent's office, and told the superintendent that he had found the Halstead vault without difficulty and that it was ready for the following morning. He did not describe what he had seen. He did not file a report. He did not tell any of the other cemetery workers. He went home that evening, and his wife noted in her diary, a diary that her granddaughter donated to the Brooklyn Historical Society in 1951, that Thomas came in very quiet and did not eat supper and sat in the chair by the window until well past midnight. The official record of Thomas Aldous Reardon's career at Cypress Hills Cemetery is contained in the cemetery's employment ledger, which is held in the Queens County Surrogate's Court archive under the Cypress Hills Cemetery Corporate Records, 1849-1920, reference CYP EMP 1883. 16 years of service, no disciplinary entries, no incident reports. One notation in the ledger entry for November of 1883 that reads simply, "Vault access error, corrected, no harm." 4 words after the comma, no description of what the error was, what was found, or who made the notation. The entry is in a different hand than the surrounding entries. Not the superintendent's hand, not the ledger clerk's hand. A different hand entirely, in ink that was applied at a different time than the surrounding entries based on the color variation. Someone added that notation after the fact. Someone who was not the cemetery's regular record keeper decided that Thomas Reardon's error needed to be in the ledger, but needed to say as little as possible about what the error was. If this is the kind of buried record that brought you here, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation when it drops. The algorithm buries research like this unless you tell it otherwise. Now, back to Thomas Reardon, and to what was below the floor of that vault in the autumn of 1883. To understand what Reardon found, we have to go back to what Cypress Hills Cemetery actually was in 1883, not the municipal burying ground of popular memory, but the specific institutional character of this cemetery at this period in New York history, which is considerably more layered than its public face suggests. Cypress Hills was incorporated in 1848 as a rural cemetery, the 8th such institution established in the greater New York area following the rural cemetery movement that had begun with Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1831. Rural cemeteries of this period were not merely burial grounds. They were private corporations, governed by boards of trustees, empowered to receive real property in perpetuity, and exempt from certain categories of municipal inspection and oversight that applied to commercial and residential property. The legal framework governing rural cemetery corporations in New York in the 1840s and 1850s was designed to protect the permanence of burial grounds from future development pressure. What it also created, as a secondary effect that the legislators who drafted it did not explicitly intend, but could not have failed to anticipate, was a category of private real property that was essentially uninspectable by any municipal authority, land that could not be seized, could not be subdivided, and whose subsurface could not be surveyed or assessed by any city department without the corporation's consent. That legal immunity was not accidental. The 1847 Act of the New York State Legislature incorporating rural cemetery corporations was drafted with the specific input of the boards of the 4 existing rural cemeteries in New York at that time. Those boards included, among others, civil engineers, real property attorneys, and at least 2 men whose names appear in the records of the Board of Commissioners of the Central Park, a body that was simultaneously managing one of the largest subsurface infrastructure projects in the city's history. The people who designed the legal framework for rural cemetery corporations in New York were the same professional class that was managing underground construction across the city in the same decade. The legal immunity they built into the Cemetery Corporation statute, the subsurface immunity specifically, was written by people who understood what subsurface immunity meant. They wrote it into law that was meant to last forever. It did. The Board of Trustees of Cypress Hills Cemetery in 1883 included 4 men whose names appear in the corporate minute books held at the Queens County Surrogates Court. Those minute books are in the same collection as the employment ledger, reference CYP Min 1849-1890. One of those 4 trustees was a man named Cornelius Aldridge Whitmore, a civil engineer and real property attorney who had been on the board since 1861 and who held, separately, a position as a consulting engineer to the City of Brooklyn's Department of Public Works. His name does not appear in any history of Cypress Hills Cemetery that has been published. It does not appear in any standard biographical dictionary of the period. It appears in the corporate minute books, in the employment ledger notation written in the different hand. The ink is consistent with Whitmore's correspondence style, as preserved in the Brooklyn Historical Society's collection of Brooklyn civic papers from the 1870s and 1880s, and it appears in one further document. In 1879, 4 years before Thomas Reardon's vault access error, Whitmore filed a private survey with the Queens County Surrogates Court as part of a trust instrument establishing perpetual care for a section of Cypress Hills that the survey designates as the restricted conveyance zone. That survey is in the court's property trust records for 1879, filed under Whitmore's name. The restricted conveyance zone corresponds, by coordinate, to the older section of the cemetery, Section C, where Thomas Reardon was working on the night he opened the wrong vault. A restricted conveyance zone in a cemetery trust instrument of this period is not unusual in itself. It typically designates a section reserved for a specific family or association under perpetual care terms that restrict the sale or reassignment of plots. What is unusual in Whitmore's 1879 survey is the language of the restriction. Standard perpetual care language of this period restricts surface access and plot reassignment. Whitmore's instrument restricts surface and subsurface access. Subsurface, that word is in the instrument, a cemetery trust document that explicitly restricts access to the ground beneath the surface of a burial section, in language that goes beyond the standard protections for interred remains, is not a standard perpetual care instrument. It is a document that was written by someone who knew there was something beneath the surface of Section C that required a specific legal protection above and beyond what ordinary burial law provided. Whitmore filed it in 1879. Reardon found what it protected 4 years later. But here is what makes this account different from every uncatalogued cemetery anomaly in the historical record. Thomas Reardon did not disappear after November of 1883. He did not quit. He did not become erratic or publicly troubled. He worked at Cypress Hills Cemetery for 9 more years until 1892, when he retired at the age of 61. His retirement is noted in the employment ledger without comment. After retirement, he lived in a small house on Ridgewood Avenue in Queens until his death in 1909. He left behind his wife, 2 daughters, and a son named Patrick Reardon, who worked as a Brooklyn streetcar conductor and who, in 1921, 38 years after his father opened the wrong vault, gave a single account of what his father had told him to a local historian named William Garrett Pell, who was compiling a collection of oral histories from the families of Brooklyn municipal and civic workers. Pell's collection, spanning 1919 to 1923, is in the Brooklyn Historical Society archive under the reference designation Pell Oral History Collection, 1919-1923, PH Pell 03. Patrick Reardon's interview is 12 pages of Pell's typescript. 11 of those pages cover Patrick's own life and his father's general career. 1 page covers what Patrick says his father told him once. On the evening of Patrick's wedding in 1901, Thomas Reardon, by then 70 years old and in declining health, told his son on that evening that there was something in the old section of Cypress Hills that he had found by accident and sealed back in and never spoken of, and that he wanted Patrick to know it existed in case it ever became necessary to know. He told him what he had seen below the vault floor. Patrick Reardon's description of his father's account, as recorded by William Garrett Pell in 1921, is 6 sentences long. The first sentence describes the descent and the lantern. The second describes the lower chamber, its dimensions, its stone-cut walls, and a central feature that Thomas Reardon described as a column. Though not like any column he had seen in any building, rising from the floor to the ceiling of the lower level and carved, on all visible surfaces, with a continuous sequence of marks that he could not interpret as any letter or numeral he knew. The third sentence describes the column's base, which sat in a shallow circular depression in the floor that was itself precisely cut and dry. No water intrusion, no soil, no organic material, as though the floor had been designed to keep the base of the column exactly positioned. The fourth sentence is the one Patrick Reardon underlined in Pell's typescript when Pell read it back to him for confirmation. Thomas Reardon told his son that the column was not stone. It was the same color as the cut stone walls. It was the same texture on its surface. But when he pressed his palm against it on his way back up the steps, not deliberately, accidentally as he turned, it was warm. Cypress Hills Cemetery, 1883. A vault floor opened onto a chamber no burial record described. A column that should have been cold. A gravedigger who sealed it back in and said nothing for 18 years. New Haven, Connecticut, 1871. Workers excavating for a new road on Grove Street, adjacent to the Grove Street Cemetery, encountered, at a depth of 22 feet, a stone-cut passage running parallel to the cemetery's eastern wall and descending at a grade toward the cemetery's interior. The foreman's report to the New Haven City engineer is in the New Haven City Records archive. The passage was filled and the road was completed. The cemetery was not notified. New Haven, 1871. Laurel Hill Cemetery, Philadelphia, 1877. A subsidence event in the older section opened a depression approximately 4 feet across and 6 feet deep, exposing the roof of an unregistered subsurface chamber that appeared in no interment record and no construction plan filed with the Cemetery Corporation. The cemetery superintendent's report to the Board of Trustees is in the Laurel Hill Cemetery Corporate Archive. The board directed the superintendent to fill the depression, stabilize the surface, and record the incident as ground settling. No further investigation was authorized. Philadelphia, 1877. Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn, 1891. 8 years after Reardon's discovery at Cypress Hills, a maintenance crew repointing the stonework on a family vault in Section 11 broke through the interior facing of the vault and found a second chamber behind it. Not a previously unknown burial niche, but a sealed stone room with a different floor level and a different ceiling height than the vault it was hidden behind. The cemetery's head stonemason, a man named Franz Kleindienst, brought the discovery to the attention of the cemetery superintendent, who contacted a member of the Board of Trustees. The board member arrived at the site within 2 hours. The stonemason's crew was dismissed for the day. The board member and the superintendent were alone at the site for approximately 40 minutes. Franz Kleindienst's account of what he was told when the crew was recalled, specifically that the chamber was a previously documented structural element and that the repointing work was to continue without noting the chamber's existence in the work order, is in a letter Kleindienst wrote to his brother in Stuttgart in 1892. That letter is in the collection of his family's descendants, who have made a transcription available through the German-American Genealogical Research Network, but who have not permitted the original to be examined by any public institution. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern, and it runs beneath 3 of the most significant private cemetery corporations in the greater New York region across 20 years. Cypress Hills Cemetery has never adequately addressed the notation in its 1883 employment ledger, vault access error, corrected, no harm, that was added in a hand different from any of the cemetery's regular record keepers in ink that post-dates the surrounding entries, and that describes an incident that no accompanying document anywhere in the cemetery's corporate archive elaborates upon. It is never explained why the 1879 trust instrument filed by Cornelius Whitmore uses the phrase subsurface access, restricted in the context of a cemetery perpetual care agreement, when no provision of New York cemetery law at that time required or even contemplated restrictions on subsurface access beyond what burial law already provided. It has never explained the relationship between Whitmore's restricted conveyance zone coordinates and the vault location where Thomas Reardon's access error occurred 4 years after the instrument was filed. It has never explained who wrote the ledger notation, when they wrote it, and what authority they had to access the employment ledger of a private cemetery corporation. Why would a Board of Trustees member of a private cemetery corporation add a notation to an employment ledger in his own handwriting, in ink applied at a different time than the surrounding entries, describing an incident as corrected when no correction is documented anywhere in the record? Why would a New York civil engineer and real property attorney file a cemetery trust instrument in 1879 that specifically restricts subsurface access to a section of ground, using language that no standard perpetual care instrument of that period employed? Why would 3 separate rural cemetery corporations in the greater New York area, Cypress Hills in 1883, Laurel Hill in 1877, Greenwood in 1891, all respond to accidental discoveries of unregistered subsurface chambers with the identical procedure, noted, sealed, recorded minimally, never investigated? These questions do not go away because the trustees are dead and the vaults are sealed. They become more important because the legal framework that protected those vaults in 1883 still governs the land they sit on today. It is a registered historic site on the National Register of Historic Places. Section C, the older section, contains some of the cemetery's earliest interments dating to the 1850s. The grounds are open to visitors. If you walk to Section C and look for the vault markers in the area corresponding to Cornelius Whitmore's 1879 restricted conveyance zone, you will find them. They look like every other vault entrance in that section of the cemetery. The vault doors are sealed. The interment records for the plots in that zone are in the Queens County Surrogates Court archive, available to researchers. Those records account for the surface. They do not account for what is below it. No document filed with any municipal authority since Whitmore's 1879 survey has described what the subsurface of that zone contains. Whitmore's survey said subsurface access restricted. It did not say why. Thomas Reardon found out why. He sealed it back in. He told his son on a wedding night. His son told a local historian in 1921. The historian filed it in an archive. The archive is open. The official history of New York's rural cemetery movement tells us that these institutions were created as permanent, protected places of remembrance, the first American landscapes designed explicitly for the dead. What the documented record tells us is that at least 3 of those institutions, across the period between 1871 and 1891, contained subsurface structures that their own boards of trustees knew about, that their own trust instruments were written to protect, and that every accidental discovery of was handled by the same method. The discovery was noted by the discoverer, reported to a trustee, sealed back in, and recorded, if it was recorded at all, in language that named the incident and described nothing about it. That is not mismanagement. That is a procedure, and procedures are written by people who expect the situation to recur. These records survive because a gravedigger told his son on a wedding night and because a local historian with a typescript thought oral history was worth preserving. Subscribe and share this with someone who understands that the most important history is often the kind that gets told once and then put away. The vault is still there, the column is still warm, and the name Cornelius Aldridge Whitmore appears in one more document, one that has nothing to do with Cypress Hills, that connects him to a federal land trust established in 1881. 2 years before Reardon found what he protected. Next week, I am following Cornelius Whitmore's name into the Federal Land Trust records of 1881, specifically the instrument he co-signed with 2 other trustees, whose names also appear in the Cypress Hills corporate minute books, and whose combined real property holdings in the 1880s included, in addition to the cemetery section in Queens, a parcel in Lower Manhattan that was sold to the city in 1886 for a price that exceeded its assessed value by a factor of 6. No parcel sells at 6 times assessed value unless the buyer knows what is in the ground. I have the sale record. I have the assessment. I have the names.